Hello, this is Richard Thornton, part 3 of our series on Teotihuacan and the mountain above it, Cerro Gordo. It's a different world we live in today. You only can understand the situation I was in as a student at Georgia Tech if you see how our society has changed. Until the 1980s, the heroes of both the United States and Mexico were middle-class men and women who accomplished great things in their profession or the arts. In particular, medical doctors, architects, engineers, scientists, archaeologists, artists, and experienced actors were highly respected. Beginning in the 1980s, the people who were able to accumulate the most money, corporate moguls, professional athletes, and young sexy actresses became our demigods. People respect you according to your income. That's always been the case. Your salary is relative to how it's valued by that society. To give you an understanding how things have changed, an actual earning power, when I graduated with a 5-year degree from Georgia Tech, would be the equivalent of $100,000 a year now, which is double what a 6-year graduate of Georgia Tech with a master's in architecture makes today when they start out. When I graduated from graduate school, it was even more. So it'd be way, way beyond what either architects or planners could expect to earn today in real money. That gives you an idea of what it was like for me to anticipate being with two of the greatest archaeologists in the world. It'd be the equivalent today of having an appointment to spend the morning with the CEO of Apple or Microsoft or one of the other large Fortune 500 companies. It was an experience of a lifetime for a student. Well, probably older archaeologists would know who Ignacio Bernal and Roman Pinachan are. Perhaps the younger ones wouldn't. But they were two of the greatest archaeologists of the late 20th century in the world. They created what we know today about Mexico. Until they came along, it was a little known story, much of it unwritten. There are other names earlier than them in archaeology in Mexico, but they did not have the international exposure these two men had. Whenever either one of these men would make a discovery in Mexico, often there would be headlines in the newspapers of the United States. That's back when people read the newspaper. Ignacio Bernal came a little bit earlier than Pinachan. Both of them worked on the famous sites that tourists go to today and also supervised their restoration. Most of the books that are commonplace on Amazon.com about Mexico were written by one of these two men. Some have been updated. We know much more about these civilizations then than we did in 1970, but yet their name remains the same. And here I was to be meeting with these two men and be giving a royal tour of the entire museum, all 6 floors. The museum is unchanged since the 1960s. It was a brand new building when I came there, but it's the same museum, still considered one of the great museums in the world. It's located next to Chapultepec Park in the nicest area of Mexico City, surrounded by park and forest land. The focal point of the museum is a central courtyard with a huge sunscreen on it which overhangs a fountain. This is a very famous piece of architecture. Here's a close-up of the fountain itself. It flows constantly day and night. On the hour, a conch shell blows an eerie sound that brings you back 1,000 years to central Mexico. Nearby is an ancient statue of Tlaloc the Rain. Within the museum are many architectural models of the great cities of Mexico. This is Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs. Close-up view of the Templo Mayor, or the Great Temple, and in foreground is the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Here's the Temple of the Niches of the Totonacs. The Totonacs departed Teotihuacan around 600 AD and established a new capital in northern Veracruz. It was destroyed by the Chinchimek barbarians around 1200 AD. These are the famous giant warriors from the Temple at Tula, which is capital of Toltecs, found around 900 AD. One of the Maya rooms. Here's some more Aztec statuary. Some of these you've seen before. Close-ups of the so-called Aztec calendar, and on the left of another statue out of ceramic clay of Tlaloc. You always can tell Tlaloc because the head supersized, looks like goggles on his eyes. No one knows what the significance of that is, but that's in all the cultures of Mexico. You'll see those goggles, even the Maya and their rain god. Some Aztec statues. These are Olmecs. Notice the heads on these Olmecs. They're supersized, look very similar to the people of Paracas who had the oversized heads that recently been discovered to be not indigenous Americans or originating from the area east of Turkey. They're not from a UFO, they're actually humans. At least the ones here were human. Here's a reproduction of the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, the side of an entire building inside the museum. Well, you probably wonder, why do I have all these details from so long ago? How can you possibly remember? Well, first of all, I had over 2,500 slides I took, which I can use as a reminder. But I kept a daily journal. And with that daily journal, I'm able to tick ancient memories in the backs and recesses of my head that perhaps would have remained forgotten. Another interesting thing is the date that we finally got to meet was the anniversary of when the original copy of the Creek Migration Legend was placed on a ship in Savannah, Georgia, and dispatched to His Royal Highness King George II. This bears directly on our discussion of Mexico because in the original Creek Migration Legend it describes migrations of the various bands of the Creek Confederacy from Mexico, in some cases from Peru, but mostly from Mexico and different parts of Mexico. This is absolute proof that culturally we have always said we're from Mexico and we're part Maya. Within the journal, I kept sketches of the buildings I saw. These became very valuable later on when I was studying the domestic architecture of the indigenous peoples of the Southeast, because then I could see the exact same buildings being constructed, say at Etowah Mounds as I saw in northern Veracruz. There was an architectural connection. Well, this is when the story gets interesting. About 5 minutes into our tour of the museum, Ignacio Bernal realized that I was not a rich gringo, as he had been told. I was not even an architect. I was an architecture student, and even worse, I was just beginning to learn Spanish. I was better than I was 2 weeks ago because I've been living with a Mexican family, but I couldn't carry on a conversation. I just pick up words. He looked at me, frowned, he looked at his watch and said, "Idiotos," and walked away. I never saw him again, although officially he was the co-coordinator of my fellowship. I never heard from him or saw him again. But there was a rapport between me and Dr. Pina Chan. He was half Maya, and I'm of partial Creek descent. We're both mestizos, and I think he realized that. And although his English was not perfect, he could converse. And when he didn't know words, Alejandra, his graduate assistant, would come in and translate. I think she went to undergraduate school in Texas, so she had fluent English. I had planned to give a book each to both of these famous archaeologists. I was told by the consul in Atlanta that it was customary for a graduate student to give a book or something like that, or an artifact, to a professor who was volunteering his or her time to help a student, perhaps with a fellowship like in my case, or with their thesis or their dissertation. Your thesis advisor, your faculty advisor. This is a way of saying thank you for taking the time out for doing something you don't have to do and you're not being paid for. Well, I did that, and so I handed both books to Dr. Pina Chan since Bernal was gone at the entrance to his offices, and we bade farewell. He told me to come back and would have a conference in a couple of days about my travel plans. I went on outside the museum at the bus stop here. This is the location where I was standing, and then Alejandra came rushing out. Lovely woman, young woman. She was about my age, in fact. I mean, it was quite a sight seeing her race across the patio there. And she said, Dr. Pinchan wants you to come back and have lunch with him. I said, oh? He's been looking at your books. He has many questions for you. Do you have time, Senor Thornton, to come back and spend an hour or so with him? I said, yes. Well, that was the beginning of actual working relationship and friendship with Dr. Pina Chan. He was thumbing through this book, Sun Circles and Human Hands, and he came to photographs of the famous marble statues at Etowah. Said, He said, Ricardo, why did your Indios make marble statues of Maya slaves? That planted the seeds for the events that occurred in the 21st century. Here was a world-famous archaeologist who saw what I later would see. There was a direct cultural connection between Etowah mounds and the Maya culture. We went through his book, and on his subject, he compared the art. What he finally decided was he thought that, at least initially, most of the Maya immigrants were commoners, illiterate, perhaps escaped slaves, like in the movie Apocalypto, and they were mostly men. The reason he said they were mostly men was that the pottery in the Southeast is generally quite different than Mesoamerican pottery. Now, I now know that the pottery of the Creeks is pretty much identical to the Panoan peoples of Peru, and we now know that prior to the Mayas ever coming to Georgia, the Peruvians came to Georgia about 500,000 years earlier, because there are many customs within the Creek culture and even words that are straight from Peru. In fact, there were Native American towns in Georgia in the 1500s that have the exact same name as existing Native American towns in eastern Peru today. So that's when those seeds were planted. Dr. Pinchan was not at all pleased with my travel itinerary prepared by the professors at Georgia Tech. He asked me, did I want to be a typical turisto, or did he want me to learn the architecture of ancient Mexico? And I said I'd go for the latter. So he tossed my itinerary into the trash can and told me to come back the next day, and Alejandro would give me a new copy of where he wanted me to go. But he said, the first thing is I want you to spend a week at Teotihuacan. And so my adventure began the next week. I almost finished seeing the major town sites and city sites in Mexico City itself. They were mostly of Aztec construction, or one of the allies of the Aztecs. So I had a open schedule for the following week to spend entirely at Teotihuacan. My first day at Teotihuacan, my first picture. I was in absolute awe. I cannot believe I was actually here, and there's these massive monuments, 2,000 years old. Still, the times I've gone there since then, I never stopped being in awe when I walked down the main plaza and the avenue at Teotihuacan. This is a view of the lower plaza, the Pyramid of the Moon, looking across to the other end of the town, and on your left is the Pyramid of the Sun. This is a view from the top of the Pyramid of the Sun of Cerro Gordo in the background. I'm This particular trip was later in the summer. I was with Alicia and the weather was better. We were standing with the wind blowing our faces, looking across the valley. Incredible experience. Here's a close-up of the Pyramid of the Moon with Cerro Gordo in the background. Now, later on in this program, we'll be climbing up this mountain. This is the radar station that I ended up at the top of the mountain. So I want to give you the idea of the relationship of all the spaces. Pyramid of the Moon, Cerro Gordo side, I go up here, there's the radar station. On the third day of the Pyramid of Teotihuacan, I climbed up again on the Pyramid of the Moon, and this is how your mind is funny after all these years. I remembered in my mind that I had walked over the Pyramid of the Moon and gone down the other side and then gone straight up the mountain from there. That's not what happened. When I actually looked back at my journal, I did climb up to the Pyramid of the Moon again last time, right up to here, but it was blocked off on the other side, and I had this sudden urge to climb that mountain. I couldn't understand it, but I had this urge. But I didn't do it that day. As my mind remembered I did, but I did not. What I did is I came back the next morning and walked directly from the bus stop across the eastern edge of the ruins, which was off limits to the public, guarded by soldiers. But I was carrying a INH photo ID slung from my neck, and the soldiers didn't bother me. I guess because I was carrying a camera case and had the ID, they thought I was an archaeologist or someone official, and I didn't really look like a gringo. Didn't really look like a Mexican. I was tall for a Mexican, but they didn't know what I was. Maybe I was from northern Mexico. So no one bothered me as I went across the ancient ruins that the public never sees. Here's the route. As I said, this is the Pyramid of the Sun, Moon, but what I did is did this. Got back in line with the moon and headed straight for the top of the mountain, aligning my height more or less with the orientation of 15 degrees off center of Teotihuacan. Then when I returned to Mexico at Christmas time, spent 2 weeks with Alicia Rosales, we went up another route this way along a road that goes evidently back then connected with the radar station. However, we were stopped by a guard right here. We had to turn around and go back. Now, what I've done in this program is combine photos from both trips at different elevations. The only difference you'll notice is that the wintertime photos, everything is brown, and yet at one place you'll see a Noche Buena tree, which is the poinsettia blooming. Of course, that would be December, when actually it was July when I did the first climb and made the major discoveries. We did see a few ruins on that December, but I didn't realize the significance and wouldn't and for another 4 or 5 decades. We'll talk about it on our last program, program 4. This is looking back to the south along Teotihuacan. This is the complex as it looked in 1970. This is of the Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. This has now been restored. It looks quite different now than when I was there. This is San Juan de Teotihuacan, the town off to the southwest. Things I'm beginning to climb elevation. This was made of a telephoto lens from let's say the foothills of Cerro Gordo. As I walked through San Martin de las Piramides, there was a festival. It's like straight out of a Hollywood movie of the festival of San Martin, and complete with them carrying a statue of the saint on a litter, and then a brass band playing, amateurishly playing some song as they marched along on a dirt road. At that time, most of the streets in San Martin were either clay or sand paved. Here you see me going out through town on the beginning of that's Cerro Gordo off the distance, getting to see how far I actually walked. This is an irrigated agave field, one of the few places around there where I saw a lot of water. When Teotihuacan was built, it was surrounded with swamps. The entire valley would have looked like this, but now the water table has dropped, so there's only a few locations that seldom the tourists see where you actually get a feeling of what the place looked like back then. It was swampy with a series of ponds and lagoons. A little bit higher in elevation, I came to the cactus with a tuna cactus. This is an edible fruit. Also, the pods here, they're edible. You remove the prickly pear. It's also called the prickly pear in the United States, but this is a fruit often eaten at breakfast time in Mexico. A little bit higher up, this is beginning to see some trees. I believe these are eucalyptus trees. Another view, I'm getting closer and closer to the mountain, but again, you can see it's quite a bit of difference right there. We're getting higher up. Notice the stone walls here. I was beginning to see artifacts all over the ground. Here's some left of another stone wall. You could tell that mankind had been there for a long, long time. Here you see the wall there? Yeah, that's a ruin of a building, where now it's just a rundown field that's so infertile that all it'll grow is prickly pear cactus. Here's some more stones. The white stain in the soil, that is plaster of lime that after so many centuries has just stained the soil. This would have been a plastered building right here. It looks like a bank to you, I'm sure. But trust me, there was artifacts everywhere. Here's a mound, about the size, let's say, of Mound B at Etowah Mound, or some of the lower mounds at Moundville, Alabama. No signage. You can see where people are driving up here and digging into the mound. I have no idea when this was built. You can see artifacts are scattered across the ground. That's bits of lime plaster. I just amazed. Things like this would be totally off limits, but there's so many in the valley around Teotihuacan that such sites are generally ignored. And I went back onto the road, heading towards the mountain. This is some of the artifacts I picked up. I had several bags, but I wanted to see, this is a view of what the ground looked like in fields. Absolutely incredible. This is a particular photograph, maybe that's more concentrated at this location than some places, but it's not really that different from what I saw for 2.5 miles of artifacts. This is not pottery. That's why I add on label. These are bits of lime plaster that would have been on the outside of the building, but the artifacts here, there's obsidian, I believe, or pottery, and there's some obsidian, but different types of pottery. Now, the thing that's I didn't realize at the time, but I now do, is that the most common pottery I saw was like this, and this is called redware. It's identical to the redware in Georgia. As you can see, the pottery made by the commoners living in the suburbs of Teotihuacan, there was very little difference in what you'd find in the southeastern United States from that same period. Very little difference, and sometimes identical. Here we see a large building. This is actually the walls of a building. The road bypasses it, but these are stone, plastered, covered in pottery. Here you see lime, it's kind of melted into the ground, rocks. Here's the rest of the walls of the building. It's like this for 2.5 miles. The city was enormous. It reached all the way to the mountain. So many ruins. There's no telling what's in these ruins. No one knows how old they were. Did they coincide with the main city? Were they built before then, afterwards? They really don't know, because no one has had the chance even to look into them. Then I start climbing the mountain and my heart swells. I look back. I realize something very special is happening in my life. The vegetation looks so familiar. At first, what am I seeing? I've been here before, but I haven't been here before. It was weird. It was a surrealist experience, like I'd been here earlier in my life, but I didn't see, why would I know this place? Now, he lived here in an earlier life? I don't know. But I've never been anywhere in my entire life that looked like this, yet I knew I had been there. I came across the aqueduct. Aha! They store the water on top of the mountain. Here, looking down into the aqueduct where it had fallen through. This is the main water supply for the city. I reached the top. I thought it was the top, but it was not the top. It kept on going. I was up and up and up, and I had no idea how tall the mountain was. It actually was a 10,000 foot mountain. I kept on across a large field you see here, which the size of Stone Mountain, but it was just it had terraces everywhere. And I didn't, it's like I was in another world, another planet as far, but I could always look back and see those ruins. You see the vegetation is changing here too as you get higher up on the mountain. It's not nearly as desert looking. This is something like a rhododendron. Another view looking back down across that field. I started seeing these stone walls. Again, I said, where have I been here before? I mean, what is this place? It kind of reminded me in a way of Fort Mountain, because I've been to Fort Mountain, but the rocks were much bigger. Now these rocks here, almost all of them, weigh several hundred pounds. It's not, the wall was like 3 or 4 feet high. But it's like I had this feeling that I'd been there before. I couldn't understand it. But who could have lifted these rocks up? And you could see where many more had fallen down to there. But these were terraces. And in part 4, you'll see what they look like from the satellite image. But the entire mountain was covered in agricultural terraces. And occasional cow. I don't know what that cow was doing there. It was in the middle of nowhere on the side of the mountain. There was a cow watching me. Maybe it was a feral cow that escaped and life was good inside the side of a mountain. Here's some of the vegetation close up. I'm not sure what these plants are. That's a type of agave. This particular one, if you rub the sides, it would shrivel up. I think we have something similar to that in North Georgia around granite outcrops. Here's some flowers I photographed climbing up the mountain. Again, these are stone walls. Can you see the stone walls? It's just the flowers are growing out of the cracks in the walls. Evidently got more water at the base of the terrace. I'm higher up, looking across the valley to the west here. Then I got to the top, and there's even larger rocks. Now, some of these rocks probably weighed a ton or more. And if you look carefully here, you can see some petroglyphs. See them right there? It's not even clear in this picture, and I didn't even notice it to the time that I was preparing this program. I said, oh my gosh, there are petroglyphs there. I didn't notice it when I took the picture. There might be some here too, but you can see the circles there. These rocks, 2,000 pounds, you know, who and how could they pick this? It was some type of fortification. Occasionally had these cracks, see the like that. It looked like it was where someone could fire bow and arrows through the cracks. So it was hastily built maybe, but it was a wall that, along the crest of the mountain. At the base of this wall, the ground was strewn with obsidian. This is just some of the obsidian that I picked up there just in a matter of a few minutes. These are adelalto points. That's an arrowhead. These are blades on a Mesoamerican sword. It was basically like a saw, if you can imagine a two-sided saw with razor sharp chips there. Here's another. All types of things there, and they're all at the foot. And in a few places, I actually saw what looked like bones, very old bones, chips of bones. I wasn't sure what I was looking like, but I was fairly sure a battle had been fought there because all of the obsidian blades were on the downside of the walls. If somebody was attacking that rock wall, and they were stopped by at least for a while. Then we get to the magical mystery part. I climbed over the wall, went a short distance, and there was standing a Native American shepherd dressed in typical white campesino, unbleached cotton outfit. I tried speaking to him in Spanish. He understood my Spanish, actually, I could tell, but he couldn't speak. He put his hand to his mouth and shook his head, and then he put his fingers to his ears and shook his head as affirmative, like I can hear but I can't speak. And then it dawned on me, this was the exact same man that I saw in my dream when the summer I was turned 18. If you remember part one, I had this repetitive dream of coming up a desert mountain and coming to a man, an Indian man, who would not speak to me. And there he was. And I tried to take his picture. He got very upset. He turned his back to me and shook his head. And then I took out a sketch pad and I asked him if I could do this, and he said yes. So he sat there for a little while. This is the sketch. I think there were some goats. Yeah, there's some goats in there. A sketch and some goats. He was like, and then I told him I was thirsty. Did he have any water? He didn't have any water, but he had goat milk. And so it's the first time I ever drank goat milk. It was not hot. I don't know how he kept it cool, but it's rather refreshing. And he gave me some goat cheese. And then I told him I had to keep on going up the mountain. I asked him if there were any people up here, and he pointed to the east, I guess towards the radar station. And then he handed me a goat kid. I don't know what that was about. He picked up this little goat that's been and handed it to me. I think he was giving me the goat kid, but what was I going to do with a goat kid on top of a mountain And then when I come back to the Soto family, hey guys, I got a goat now. Can I keep him in my bedroom? Well, I didn't know I petted the goat. It's the first time I ever held a goat in my life, and it was a sweet little thing. Went, beep, beep. And then I handed it back to him and started westward towards the radar station, shaking my head. I said, what have I just experienced? I mean, I dreamed this guy. And it's exactly as he said. I told me to go east first and then west, and I go through a gateway formed by these giant boulders, and I come into a vision of paradise, just like my dream. This is a photograph I took when I came through the gateway. It was a green pasture. It had cattle and sheep on it. It had alpine type trees. See the trees growing there? Entirely different vegetation than on the side of the mountain. There were oak trees, there were fir trees, there was water, the grass is green. It's exactly like my dream. There is some things in our lives we just cannot explain, and this is one of them. As I headed back west again to where he said there were people, I didn't know where I was going to at the time, I came across petroglyphs. Now, it's meant nothing to me back then. I don't want you to think I'm smarter than I was. I was really wet behind the ears, didn't know diddly squat about such things. But here, while doing the slide, I recognize a symbol that appears on petroglyphs in Georgia. This is a comet. Can you see that right there? Now, this is the Mesoamerican numerical system. I'm not sure what this is. I wish I'd taken more pictures when I was there, but again, I was just a young architecture student, and something like this had only been minor interest to me. I did notice, though, that the stela had been broken in pieces. This was the largest piece. It says someone did not like whoever made this stela. This is something that you find all over Teotihuacan, but I was surprised to find it on top of the mountain. It is a cross with a pecked circle around it. Current belief is that it was used by surveyors for laying out Teotihuacan. I'm not so sure, but the same symbol can be seen on several petroglyph sites in the North Georgia mountains, and in particular Track Rock Gap. See the peck? It's called a pecked circle cross. There's a cross, there's a circle. I didn't know what it was at the time. Honestly, again, I was wet behind the ears. It's just now that things like this are making any sense to me. I was just instructed by my faculty advisor, Ike Supporta, to take pictures of anything I saw, whether or not it was architecture, whether interesting. If I came and saw something different, photograph it. I'm glad I did. I came up to ruins. You can see them here. I eventually counted 4 or 5 layers of different type of stonework of a major complex like a small city on top of the mountain. Now, at this point, I'm at the top of Cerro Gordo, and I came up this building here. You see, it was beginning to get cloudy. It had been raining down below, and I was dehydrated. I was starving. Did not bring a compass with me. I didn't bring a canteen. I didn't bring any food, snacks, nothing. No trail mix. And back then there were no maps. I mean, basically wherever I went in Mexico, I didn't know where I was going until I got there. But you can see multiple layers of buildings, more or less the type thing you'd see, say in Peru, where you have multiple layers of stone buildings, one on top of another. I got up to the door of the building. I wasn't sure what I was at, except it was a radar antenna. Knocked on the door. It had no windows. And I heard voices inside in Spanish, very excited voices. And then the door slightly opened, and a hand with a revolver stuck out. Oh, geez. We're up the creek now. Actually, I didn't say creek. I said something else. But anyway, I'm going to be gunned down on top of a mountain, godforsaken mountain somewhere in Mexico. No one ever know what happened to me. And he opened the door, and in the best Spanish I could say, I told him I was an architecture student from Georgia Tech. they didn't really have a Spanish word for Georgia Tech. I was here on a fellowship under the auspices of the INAH and the Museum of Anthropology. And he still didn't say much other than point the gun at me. And then I heard a voice in the background telling him, the best I could understand in his Spanish, because I'd mentioned Ramon Pinachan right at the end. That they still said that someone in the background heard me and hollered, it's okay, let him in. He said, this is very interesting. And so they let me in. They smiled, and I showed them my ID. I was for real. And the first thing said, how'd you get here? I said, I came up the mountain. They said, that's impossible. No one comes up the mountain. No, the archaeologists don't even know it to come up the mountain. I said, well, I did. I walked up the mountain from Teotihuacan. They didn't quite believe me, but they didn't have another explanation because the only way up has a guard with machine guns, because I ran into them in December. But anyway, once they realized I was, hey, I'm a nice guy. I know neo-Nazis and Southeast don't like me now, but at least the Mexicans liked me back then. They thought I was a pretty good guy. Times change. But they invited me in. It turns out that one of the people there, the young man who said to let me in, was an anthropology student and studying at the National University in Mexico City. And of course, he recognized the name Pinachan, and he started telling me about what was up here. And I said, well, what are these ruins? He said, well, they don't tell us about it. No one knows what this is. They've never been studied, but it's like another city up here. But the best I can determine, it's older than Teotihuacan and was built by different people, but then the same people who built it stayed during the time of Teotihuacan, and he thought maybe they were the rulers. And we'll get into that in part 4. But whoever they were able to move around 2,000-pound rocks with fairly good ease, which is an achievement itself. I told them I was dying of thirst, and to this day I can still remember it. It was an aluminum pot filled with grape Kool-Aid. They said they had to boil the water up there, and they couldn't drink the water that the government furnished them, and so they mainly drank Kool-Aid. And it sticks in my mouth. I was so thirsty. And I drank the entire 2-quart pot, aluminum pot, of grape Kool-Aid. Gulped it down. They laughed. Then they had snack lunches furnished to them by the government in brown bags in the refrigerator, and they gave me one. And again, I can remember what the meal was. It had a banana in it, had a small orange or tangerine, something like that. It had a ham, and then a package of mayonnaise, and then 2 pieces of bread to make a ham sandwich with. And I had some cheese too sometimes. But anyway, because I was so hungry and so thirsty, I'd never forget that little meal. Then it came time for me to go because I knew they were busy. And what it was the main regional aircraft control center for the International Mexican Airport in Mexico City. And that's why my airplane had flown over Teotihuacan. If you recall the first part of our series, the first view of Mexico was looking down at, and only recently have I realized I was looking down at Teotihuacan. Well, the reason was the plane was flying very close to this air traffic control center. And I was leaving, the young anthropology student told me to go east of there, much farther east than I'd been earlier, and that I would see the pyramid where Montezuma worshipped. He could see his whole empire from the top of the pyramid. We're going to go there in a second. And that was the end of the meeting. I had to go on. Still not quite sure what I was doing up there, other than I knew I was supposed to be there. This is the view looking down into the valley west of Teotihuacan as I'm walking toward the pyramid. Magnificent view. And in the background you can see it's raining in Mexico City. Recently, archaeologists discovered that this mountain is covered in terraces. I don't know why they hadn't realized that Cerro Gordo is covered. For some reason, American University went here. You can see the terraces, some of them there, but the entire mountain is agricultural terraces, which is radically changing the understanding of how Teotihuacan fed itself, because they couldn't figure out how to get available land they could feed 100,000 people. Now we know that much of the farming was done on mountain terraces. This is the pyramid. As you see, some grave robbers have been in here, a little corner there, but it was mainly intact. Actually, the picture that I showed you before then was taken from the top of the pyramid, looking down, but we go in reverse order. But it was a fairly large pyramid, maybe the size of Mound C at Etowah Mounds, for those of you from Southeast. Pretty much the same shape. I mentioned it to Dr. Pena Chan in my next brown bag lunch of him when I got down the mountain, and he was unaware of any of these ruins, either the pyramid or the stone walls or the multiple layers of buildings where the radar station is. Another view looking down as I'm walking back down to the town. And that completes this part of it. Now, I wanted to kind of leave abruptly on this one because, in truth, that's what I knew for 4 decades, over 4 decades. It was the memory of those slides, what I'd seen, and it stayed in the back recesses of my mind. Now, what we're going to do in part 4, the final part of this series, is we're going back and using modern technology such as LiDAR and satellite imagery, and also archaeological work that has been done in Mexico since I was first there, and come up with an incredible new interpretation of what was on Cerro Gordo. It's going to blow your mind, folks. It's some things that normally I wouldn't have said until I looked at the facts, and gets into almost alternative archaeology, or what some archaeologists call pseudo-archaeology. But the only trouble is they haven't been there. I was on top of Cerro Gordo. See you then.